A 30-year marriage doesn't shatter. It doesn't break with the cinematic crack of thunder or the single visceral blow of betrayal. It erodes. It is a slow, insidious weathering, a process of such glacial subtlety that you don't notice the canyons being carved inside you until they are too vast to cross. It is the gentle wearing away of self, grain by silent grain, until the person sleeping beside you is more landscape than man, a familiar mountain range whose peaks and valleys you navigate by rote. Your home, a testament to a shared history, becomes a beautiful, hollow museum, and you are its curator, its head docent, its silent ghost, polishing the artifacts of a life you only pretend to inhabit. I was the curator. For 3 decades, I had meticulously maintained the exhibition of the Albrights. My husband, Arthur, a man who collected architectural accolades with the same detached fervor other men collected stamps, was the museum's primary benefactor and its most celebrated subject. I, Clara, was its most flawless and most invisible artifact. I hadn't realized the extent of my own transparency, the degree to which I had faded into the elegant wallpaper of our existence, until a stranger looked at me and saw me standing there. It happened on a crisp October evening in Boston. The air, sharp and tasting of imminent winter, felt like a baptism against the skin. Arthur was hosting a reception on the rooftop terrace of our South End brownstone, a meticulously restored 4-story testament to his success. The event was a celebration, a preening display of victory, after his firm secured the coveted new waterfront development project. Below us, the city sprawled, a glittering, indifferent tapestry of light and shadow. But up here, on our manicured perch, everything was controlled. Soft jazz bled from hidden speakers, artisanal cheeses glistened under ambient lights, and the air hummed with the low thrum of self-congratulatory chatter. I was in my element, which is to say, I was performing. The role of perfect hostess was one I knew intimately. I could play it in my sleep. I drifted between conversations, a serene, empty smile pinned to my lips. My movements were an exercise in fluid economy, refilling a glass of vintage Cabernet here, offering a miniature lobster roll there, laughing with a delicate rehearsed tinkle at a joke I hadn't heard. Arthur adored it. He bathed in the reflection of his success, and I was the silver polish that made that reflection gleam. His elegant wife, Clara, his greatest social asset. The silent, graceful machinery that made the grand architecture of his life function so smoothly. "She's a miracle worker," I heard him boom to a junior partner, his voice slick with proprietary pride. "I handle the steel and glass. She handles everything else." He gestured vaguely in my direction, and the junior partner nodded, his eyes sliding over me without registering a single detail. I was a concept, not a person. And then I felt it, a gaze. It was utterly distinct from the fleeting, transactional glances that populated my world. This was not the quick, appreciative up and down of a younger man, or the dismissive, patriarchal scan of an older one. This was a focused, unnerving stillness, a weight. I felt it on the back of my neck, a prickling sensation that made the fine hairs there stand on end. My practiced smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I turned, my eyes sweeping the terrace, and found its source. Across the expanse of slate tile standing near the parapet and silhouetted against the glowing city skyline was a man. He was alone, a stark contrast to the convivial clusters of backslapping colleagues. He held a simple glass of ice water, and he was observing the party, not participating in it. His name, I would later learn, was Julian. He was a recent and reportedly brilliant addition to the firm's risk assessment division. Arthur had mentioned him once in passing. "Former war correspondent," he'd said, chewing on a piece of toast. "A bit of a lone wolf, sees angles no one else does, makes people nervous." He wasn't handsome in the conventional, clean-shaven way of Arthur's world. There was a raw, weathered quality to him, a ruggedness in the lines around his eyes, as if the world had tried and failed to sand down his edges. His dark hair was brushed by the wind, and a few threads of gray at his temples caught the light. His eyes, even from that distance, were what held me. They didn't dart or scan. They rested on things with an unnerving, analytical weight. And for the last several minutes they had been resting on me. It wasn't a predatory look. It wasn't even overtly flirtatious. It was diagnostic. It was the kind of look that doesn't assess the curve of your hip or the style of your dress, but seems to peer directly into the structural framework of your soul. A tremor went through me, a deep, seismic shudder originating from a place I hadn't visited in years. The fault line that had been dormant for 3 decades had just cracked. When my eyes finally met his, he didn't flinch. He didn't offer a sheepish smile or look away. He held my gaze, a silent, challenging question hanging in the cold autumn air between us. I was 61 years old. I was a wife, a mother to grown children who had their own lives, a pillar of comfortable bourgeois predictability. This sort of thing wasn't supposed to move me, but it did. It moved me profoundly. I broke the connection first, turning away with a sudden, desperate need to check on the catering. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. For the next hour, I threw myself into the mechanics of hosting with a frantic energy, a deliberate distraction. I discussed the merits of different school districts with one wife, the woes of finding a reliable contractor with another. I was a ghost in my own home, haunting the conversations, leaving no trace. But I felt his eyes on me the entire time, a quiet, constant pressure. Later, as the crowd began to thin, I found myself rearranging a platter of prosciutto-wrapped figs that was already perfectly arranged. It was a nervous, pointless tick. I felt his presence beside me a moment before he spoke. "You have a photographer's eye," he said. His voice was low and calm, a resonant frequency that cut straight through the buzzing chatter of the party. I turned, startled, a fig slipping from my grasp. "I'm sorry?" I tried for a light, dismissive laugh, but it sounded brittle and strange in my own ears. "I'm not sure what you mean." "The way you arrange things," he clarified, his gaze sweeping from the platter to the careful placement of candles on a nearby table. "It's not just for aesthetics. It's not random. Every placement has intent. There's balance, tension, negative space. There's a story. It's composition." The breath hitched in my throat. The world tilted on its axis. Before Arthur, before the children, before the long, slow erasure of self, I had been a photographer. I had lived in a small, dusty, dark room in a 4th-floor walk-up, my hands perpetually smelling of fixer and developer. I had seen the world in stark, meaningful black and white frames. It was a language I had once been fluent in, a part of myself I had packed away so thoroughly I had forgotten the shape of the box. I just like things to be orderly," I managed, my voice a thin, reedy whisper. The lie felt like dust in my mouth. "No," he said, and his gaze was not unkind, but it was relentless. "It's more than that. You see the world in frames, even when you're not holding a camera." He couldn't possibly know what he had just done. He couldn't know that his words were not a simple compliment, but an act of profound archaeological excavation. He had reached into the dusty, sealed-off ruins of my past and held up a mirror to the ghost of a girl I thought had vanished forever. Before I could formulate a single coherent response, Arthur appeared, slinging a proprietary arm around my shoulders. "There you are, Julian. Glad you could make it. Isn't my Clara the best? Keeps this whole ship running, don't you, darling?" Julian's eyes, still on me, held a flicker of something unreadable. He gave a slight, enigmatic smile. "She's remarkably gifted. he said, his voice quiet but clear. "You're a very fortunate man, Arthur." That night, the apartment was cavernous and silent, save for the rhythmic, contented snores rumbling from Arthur's side of the bed. Sleep, for me, was a distant country. I lay awake, staring at the shifting shadows on the ceiling, Julian's words echoing in the vast emptiness. "You see the world in frames." Hours later, drawn by an invisible string, I found myself in the back of a cavernous walk-in closet, a space filled with Arthur's bespoke suits and my own collection of elegant beige armor. In the far corner, behind a stack of hat boxes, was a heavy mahogany chest. My fingers, trembling slightly, fumbled with the cold brass latch. I lifted the lid. The scent of cedar and thyme rose to meet me. Under a pile of yellowed linens and baby blankets, there it was, my old portfolio. The leather was cracked and dry. I pulled it out, carrying it into the living room as if it were a sacred relic. In the pale glow of the city lights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I opened it. The faces of strangers stared back at me, captured 40 years ago. An old woman's face, a roadmap of wrinkles and sorrow. A young couple laughing with a fierce, defiant joy. A child staring at the lens with an unnerving, ancient wisdom. I had seen them. I had framed their truth. My fingers, now wrinkled with age, traced the outlines of their lives. What had happened to the woman who saw those things? Where had she gone? The question was a physical ache in my chest. She hadn't died. I had buried her alive. The weeks that followed were a study in quiet torment. Julian's observation had planted a seed in the fallow ground of my soul, and I could feel it sprouting, its roots pushing through the compacted soil of my meticulously curated life. I began to notice things again, with a painful, startling clarity. The way the morning light cut across the Persian rug, illuminating a billion dancing dust motes. The intricate, impossible geometry of a spider's web on the balcony railing. The deep, weary resignation in my own eyes when I caught my reflection in a darkened window. The world was no longer a set I was moving through. It was a series of potential photographs, and the longing to capture them was a constant, low-grade fever. One afternoon, Arthur came home, tossing his briefcase onto the hall table. "Big charity gala next month," he announced, already loosening his tie. "At the Museum of Modern Art, that new minimalist exhibit you wanted to see. We should go. Have to show our faces." My first instinct was a visceral, protective no. The thought of seeing Julian again was both terrifying and intoxicating. But then, a different voice, a stronger, rustier one, spoke from deep inside me. "Go." "Yes," I said, my voice surprising me with its firmness. "I think we will." The night of the gala, I stood before my closet, pushing past the sensible silks and the muted cashmeres. My hand stopped on a dress I hadn't worn in 15 years, a gown of deep, startling crimson. I had bought it for a long-forgotten anniversary, but Arthur had declared it a bit much. It had hung there ever since, a silent, scarlet accusation. Tonight, I wasn't dressing for Arthur. I wasn't dressing for anyone. I was dressing for the woman in the old photographs. The dress fit more snugly than I remembered, but the silk felt like a second skin, like armor. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw not a 61-year-old woman trying to reclaim her youth, but a woman finally claiming her space. The museum was a cathedral of white walls and stark, challenging art. The air buzzed with the clinking of champagne flutes and forced laughter. I moved through it all, a woman in a crimson dress, feeling not like a ghost, but like a flame. I saw him almost immediately. He was across the gallery, standing before a massive, chaotic sculpture of twisted black steel. He was looking at it with that same intense, absorptive focus he had turned on me. As if sensing my presence across the crowded room, he turned his head slowly. He didn't smile, not exactly. It was a simple, silent acknowledgement. I see you. And I knew he wasn't just talking about the dress. Eventually, Arthur was predictably ensnared by a trustee, leaving me to drift. I found myself drawn to the same sculpture. It's titled Shattered Cage, a low voice said beside me. Julian. He stood a respectful distance away, his hands in his pockets. An optimistic title, I replied, my voice steady. It looks more like the Cage one. Perhaps, he conceded. Or perhaps the struggle itself is the point. We stood in a comfortable charged silence for a full minute, two strangers connected by a piece of art, having a conversation no one else could hear. The crimson suits you, he said, his eyes still on the sculpture. It's a color that doesn't apologize. I've spent a lifetime apologizing, I confessed, the words slipping out before I could stop them. For what? He asked, finally turning to me. His gaze was direct, stripped of all artifice. For taking up space, I suppose. The world is full of people who take up space, he said. Very few of them try to make it beautiful. He gestured from me to the art and back again. There's a difference between decoration and creation. You're a creator, Clara, even when you're just arranging figs on a plate. We moved from the sculpture to a photography exhibit in the next room. Stark, powerful images from a conflict zone, his past life. This was yours? I asked, looking at a devastatingly intimate portrait of a soldier. He nodded. A long time ago, I used to think the only way to find truth was to go to the most broken places on earth. And now? Now, he said, his eyes leaving the photograph and finding mine. I think the most profound truths are hidden in the quietest places. You just have to know how to look. He paused. Most people look, but they don't see. They are two very different verbs. I know, I whispered, the words filled with the weight of 30 lost years. I'd forgotten the difference. I don't think you forgot, he said softly. I think you were just convinced no one else was looking. There it was, the core of it, the simple, devastating truth. He wasn't trying to seduce me. He wasn't trying to dismantle my life. He was simply bearing witness to it. He was seeing me. That was the last time we spoke with any real intimacy. In the months that followed, he kept a respectful, almost reverent distance. A polite nod in the lobby of Arthur's firm, a brief professional smile at a company picnic. He had opened a door for me, and he was wise enough, kind enough, to let me walk through it alone. The change in me was not a revolution. It was a quiet renaissance. The first time I took my new camera out, my hands shook. The city felt too big, too loud. But then I saw it, an old man, his face a landscape of grief and resilience, illuminated by a single shaft of late afternoon sun. I raised the camera. The click of the shutter was a sound of homecoming. I began to rise before dawn, slipping out of the silent apartment while Arthur slept. I walked the frozen streets of Boston as the city slowly woke, the camera a solid, reassuring weight in my hands. I was no longer a curator of a life. I was an observer, a participant, a creator. I saw the world in frames again, and in doing so, I began to see myself. One evening, Arthur found me in my study, which was now filled with prints and contact sheets. He picked up a photograph I had taken that morning, a stark, powerful image of my own reflection, captured in a rain-streaked window, my face bisected by the city skyline. He was silent for a long time, his brow furrowed. I forgot, he said finally, his voice soft with a genuine, if fleeting, sense of wonder. I forgot you had this in you, Clara. He smiled, a gentle, distant smile, and patted my shoulder before leaving the room to watch the news. It wasn't a magical fix. He was still the mountain, and I was still the river that had learned to flow around him. Our life was still a sturdy, well-designed structure. That hadn't changed, but I had. Julian hadn't been a threat to my marriage. He had been a catalyst for my soul. He didn't offer me a new life. He simply held up a mirror, forcing me to see the one I'd let fade. The greatest affairs are not always of the body. Sometimes they are of the soul. Sometimes all it takes is a single person to truly see you, for you to finally learn to see yourself. I looked down at the photograph in my hands. The woman in the reflection was not smiling, the polite, curated smile of a hostess. Her expression was serious, questioning, and intensely, unapologetically alive. For the first time in 30 years, she wasn't an artifact. She wasn't a reflection of anyone else. She was the one holding the camera, and the entire world was her frame.